Dear friends, welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled The Making of Hinduism in Colonial India, which is a part of the political sociology paper. What do you understand by the term Hinduism? Is it a religion? Is it a very ancient religion? Or is it a philosophy that encompasses various belief structures, rituals? Or does it mean that it has a huge following in terms of different sects? This module will try and understand how Hinduism, which meant many things in the past, came to mean one particular religion which got constructed in the colonial episteme of the period when the British occupied India. Situating Hinduism in the discourse of religion. Since the category of religion is central to the different ways that a community refers to itself in the modern world, it may be useful to account for its relevance and significance. Religion was traditionally a Christian category used to mean something like faith in God, the church and priesthood who serve Him. Many deists have attempted to transform its specifically Christian elements and extend its scope as a cross-cultural category. This transformation, according to Fitzgerald, had to be understood in context of modern bourgeoisie ideology and the creation of a world market. Religion is used in a variety of contexts and includes so many different things that they have no clear meaning. Fitzgerald further writes, the construction of religion and religions as global has been part of a wider historical process of Western imperialism. Thus, religion, he argues, is tied up with the growth of Christianity. He writes that the religion word is thoroughly imbued with Judeo-Christian monotheistic association, and that this category is deeply embedded in a legitimation process within Western societies, in the dominant relation of those societies with non-Western societies. According to him, there is a direct extension of Christian theism in religion, and the term may also be deliberately used as a non-theological analytical category to make distinction between religious and the non-religious. Fitzgerald outlines certain assumptions that lie behind the phenomenology of religion, such as it is a universal phenomena to be found in principle in all cultures and all human experiences. Another pervasive assumption is that religions are defined by a common faith in the transcendent or the divine belief in superhuman agencies, or preferably in one supreme being who gives meaning and purpose to human history. In his opinion, religion should be studied as an ideological category, as an aspect of modern Western ideology, and as a basis of modern form of theology with a specific location in history. With the onset of the 20th century, other faiths aspired for world religions and described their eligibility based on dominant characteristics of a recognized religion like Christianity. Based on the discussion above, how does one recognize the status of Hinduism as a religion? A critical review of Hinduism will not only help in grasping the complexities involved in religions, but also in apprising whether it is a religion in the way that the scholars above have discussed the concept of religion. Existing scholarship on the subject, involving scholars like David Lorenzen, Vasudha Dalmia, and Robert Frykenberg, Christopher Fuller, are completely agreed on the fact that Hinduism as a category of intellectual exploration emerges in the 19th century as a result of certain historical developments that called for its construction. Clearly, prior to the existence of this category, we know that the subcontinent, as Thapar points out, is filled with a diverse range of sects and cults whose beliefs and practices have little to do with the category of Hinduism as it comes to be established in the 19th century. According to Madan, Hinduism is not a religion, for it does not have a founder or a single foundational scripture or a set of fundamentals of beliefs and practices. A notion of the supernatural is not central to it, and the idea of moral law that may be considered a substitute is highly relativistic. These and other similar doubts have been around for a long time. Srinivas himself acknowledged them and wrote about the amorphousness and complexity of Hinduism and the difficulty of defining it. Clearly, from the writings of these scholars, it becomes evident that the category of religion that is being used to characterize Hinduism is one that is developed from an understanding of monotheistic faiths like Christianity and Islam. Weber considered reverence for the Vedas and belief in the sacredness of the cow as defining features of Hinduism. But he too noted the virtual lack of dogma in Hinduism and the fact that the term itself was a recent Western coinage. He observed, Hinduism simply is not a religion in our, that is, Christian sense of the word, but is a cultural tradition. Madan further writes that some have objected that Hinduism is not an old tradition, that it is only a 19th century fabrication of Christian missionaries, Orientals, builders of the colonial archive, and would-be makers of an Indian nationalism. What has survived over centuries, Romila Thapa writes, is not a single monolith religion, but a diversity of sects which we today have put under a uniform name. Ambedkar, on the other hand, writes that in case of positive religions like Judaism, Christianity and Islam, where the origins can be traced to the teachings of great religious innovators, one does not have to search for its scheme of divine governance. It is not like an unwritten constitution. On the Hindu scheme of divine governance is enshrined in a written constitution, and anyone who cares to know it will find it laid bare in that sacred book called the Manusmriti, a divine code, which lays down the rules which govern the religious, ritualistic and social life of the Hindus in minute detail, and must be regarded as the Bible of Hindus and contained in the philosophy of Hinduism. Clearly, Ambedkar epitomizes the problem in a central way when he points out that Hinduism was not a religion because it lacked principles that define and legitimize a moral and social order. Instead, what was termed Hinduism was a set of prescriptions and prohibitions that framed along caste lines provided a vast diversity of beliefs, rituals and practices followed by diverse groups all over the subcontinent. In this sense, Hinduism could not be considered as a religion, but it is important to note here that the diverse sects and cults that were a part of the Indian culture were religious communities that practiced religion much like religion anywhere else. In other words, they comprised religious communities, they adhered to a set of ritual practices, beliefs, they subscribed to a doctrine of transcendental, and in this sense they were deeply embedded to the idea of reverence for their gods. Hence, while it may be difficult to comprehend Hinduism as a monolith religion, there is no denying the fact that the diverse existence of sects and cults clearly points to the existence of a rich religious diversity in the subcontinent. It is in this context of religious diversity that we shall now turn to an engagement with Hinduism as a religion in the way that this came to be constructed by the reform movement in the 19th century colonial India. The role of the social reform movement. By the mid-19th century, Western ideas and their effects on social and political institutions in colonial India had begun to influence almost all spheres of public life in India. The transformation in the public spheres of education, jurisprudence, administration, professions, urbanization and the public sphere compelled sections of Indian elite to engage with both intellectually and morally the changes that were taking place in the midst. Quite to the contrary, traditions, institutions of learning, legality, ritual worship and customary practices were faced with diverse criticisms from both traditionalist and modernist elites within Indian society. faced with Western ideas and radically different normative orientations from their own Indian elites, could not help but come face to face with immense backwardness and inhumanness of the social and religious practices in their own native society. Nobody was better exposed to the Western ideas and changes in effect than the Hindu elites of the 19th century. These traditional practices, which offered the picture of contrast in relation to the values subscribed by the Western societies, also represented the markers of backwardness of Indian society. The emerging viewpoints on these markers of backwardness among the native Hindu elites are largely seen as trigger for the Hindu social elites and social reformers to undertake reform activities in Hindu society, which subsequently resulted into a series of social reform movements. Scholars have seen the growth of social reform movements in the above mentioned pages in the three stages. The first stage, which was inaugurated with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, is largely marked with the efforts of the part of enlightened individuals to order their personal lives in accordance with standard adopted from the Western society. The onset of the second stage is marked by the formation of the sub-national groups and the growth of a new desire for unity between the scattered and culturally diverse social groups. Politically, this was the period when the first glimmer of nationalism appeared on the subcontinent. With the turn of the century, social reform came to mean a regeneration of traditional spirit of the nation, a regeneration founded on religious revival and cultural xenophobia. The third stage is marked when the social reform movement is merged with the rise of Hindu nationalism, where the Hindu revivalism is identified with political nationalism and defined in terms of Hindu nationalism. Ram Mohan Roy emerged as a pioneer of social reform movements in the early 19th century. He took on existing religious practices in Hinduism, which were largely guarded by priests who promoted superstitions and imposed the religious doctrines on people. He began to write against such practices of superstition and dominance of Hindu priests who devised religious doctrines in their own interest. He wrote Tuhafat ul Muwahidin, a gift to monotheists, in 1804, attacking the practices and ideologies of the Hindu priests. He sought to establish the original essence of Hinduism, which according to him were provided in the ancient texts of Vedas and Upanishads. He sought to reform Hinduism by making it more monotheistic religion. His analysis of Hinduism suggested it was due to lack of monotheistic theology in Hinduism, which promoted hierarchy among its believers. Since there is hierarchy amongst gods and the religious believers, this provided priests and religious interpreters more opportunities to spread superstitions. He sought to establish that Hinduism be considered as monotheistic religion, which has one central god, and based upon his readings of the ancient texts, he concludes that Brahma is the supreme god of Hinduism, and he is the only authority in Hinduism. Towards that, he tried to mold Hinduism by establishing Brahmo Samaj, which assumed that Brahma be considered the supreme god in Hinduism. He also sought that Vedas and Upanishads be considered the authentic source of knowledge in Hinduism. He did not only translate some Upanishads in Bengali and English to make it accessible for the public in general, but also challenged the Brahmins and Pandits for their incorrect understanding of India's Shastra and Hindu society. Overall, Roy's efforts of problematizing of Hindu traditions and advocating a rational interpretation of the holy texts were taken up by other enlightened Hindus in Bengal, Bombay, Madras. Very much akin to the rationalist approach of Rajaram Mohan Roy, in a later period must be considered the contributions of Swami Vivekananda. While he attacked the rigidity and superstition of Hindu ritual practice, he emphasized the tolerant nature of Hinduism as a religion, suggesting that it was probably the most tolerant of world religions. Most significant about Vivekananda's efforts must be seen in his ability to project Hinduism as a religion on the world stage. In his visits to both America and Britain, he was able to familiarize the West with the philosophy of Vedanta. and create awareness of the rich spiritual heritage linked up with Hinduism. It would not be wrong to suggest that following his representation of Hinduism at the Congress of World Religions in Chicago, Hinduism came to be genuinely represented as a world religion. In later half of the 19th century, Western India witnessed a host of social reforms activities largely led by the Hindu elites who got educated in Western education at Bombay University and other institutions associated with colonial regimes. Their efforts tried to bring about changes in Hindu society by providing education to lower castes, women, and marriages of widows. Besides social efforts, these reformers of Western India engaged in writings and producing social critiques of social and religious practices in Hindu society. Most of these reformers engaged to break down the religious orthodox practices and rules, considering them as signs of backwardness. Most of them contributed to social reform programs in different ways, mostly concerned about the state of backwardness in native society. The question of caste hierarchy, status of women, education, and prevailing superstition remained common concerns for these reformers. The earliest society, which was founded in 1844, was the Paramhans Mandali, which largely functioned to break the caste taboos and demolish all caste distinctions. It was a secret society whose members radically affirmed monotheism and rejected outright the doctrine of polytheism. These social reformers also tried to practice the progressive steps in their personal life. Lokhitwadi, a Brahmin by birth, employed a Muslim cook in his house. Vishnu Parshuram Shastri Pandit, who supported widow remarriage, started Vidva Vivah Uttejak Mandal in 1856 and married himself a widow in 1875. Mr. Bhandarkar performed his widow daughter's marriage in 1891. To deal with larger questions of religious beliefs and superstitions involved, M.G. Ranade started Prarthana Samaj in 1867, which actively preached monotheism and denounced priestly domination and caste distinction. Besides, their efforts involving writing fiercely against the caste and dogmatic and orthodoxical practices of priestly classes. Chiplunkar started a Marathi magazine called Nibandhamala in 1874, devoted to the cause of social reform, which was followed by many writings and periodicals. Totally different was the impact on Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who founded the Arya Samaj in 1875, which took roots in Punjab. Dayanand was not a rationalist trained in Western education. Rather, in his early years, he was trained in a Brahmanical system of traditional learning at Mathura. He learnt Western ideas through his own efforts and largely with an aim to denounce them. Dayanand combined in himself several paradoxical sentiments, extremely conservative in his thought and beliefs, sometimes to the point of obscurantism, yet astonishingly revolutionary in his attitudes and actions. Dayanand typified a complex reaction to Western influence, rejecting the existing caste basis of society, the inferior status of women, and the system of child marriages. He called for a vigorous program of social reform aimed not so much at westernizing the Hindu religion as in reviving the glory of the Vedic religion. What Dayanand sought was interest in the salvation of society by means of individual self-assertion and amelioration of social evils. Yet against the backdrop of these reforms, the moot question remains as to how the larger populace related to these changes. It needs to be said that in large measures the reform movement remained an upper caste engagement with their society. Against the tyranny and oppression of the caste system, the reform measures proposed and the agenda for the implementations were quite clearly deeply inadequate. On the other hand, for lower caste reformers like Jyotiba Phule, they were deeply suspicious of the project to build a unified Hinduism. Instead, they focused on caste oppression, insisting instead on the complete dismantling of the caste system. Not surprisingly, then the project of Hinduism through the reform movement remained an unfulfilled aspiration on the part of the sections of upper caste in Indian society. This continues to be the case even in the present period. Hinduism as ideology. The shortcomings of the reform movement in the 19th century, that is, the efforts to develop a unified religious community called Hindu, and Hinduism proved to be completely out of sync with the civilizational diversity of Indian society. To that extent, both at the level of culture and with the diverse sects that populated the subcontinent, such a project of unifying and homogenizing a religion called Hinduism proved to be deeply inadequate. It is this inadequacy that compelled the protagonists of the two-nation theory to refigure the religious project of Hinduism into a majoritarian ideology called Hindutva. This was to be achieved by linking the project of unifying Hinduism that prevailed in the 19th century to an ideological vision that represented all Hindus as a national community. Hinduism, and Hindutva were the grounds on which the nationalist ideology would seek to claim its right over the domination and power. Of considerable relevance was the effect of Dayanand Saraswati's militant spiritualism upon the emergence and development of extremist nationalism in India. By bringing the dynamism of the past to vivify the modern world, Dayanand blazed the trail for the extremists in two significant respects. One, his own deep-rooted xenophobia was carried on to subsequent generations and served to inspire the militant anti-British temper of extremist politics at the turn of the century. Connected to this was Dayanand's idea that history could be interpreted in order to justify social action. This attitude was closely followed by Tilak in his interpretation of the Gita and Savarkar in his interpretation of the Indian War of Independence. What such an ideology deeply represents is the diversity that constitutes the Hindu community and its various beliefs, ritual systems that are synchronistically organized to give impressions of what Marriott spoke of as the great tradition and the little tradition. Apart from misrepresenting this religious diversity, Hindu nationalism and its advocacy of Hinduism as a religion of the Hindus was immediately faced with the problem of caste in India. There can be no doubt that the function of caste in everyday life of Indian society contradicts every attempt at consolidating the idea of a Hindu nation. For the lower caste all over India throughout the 19th century, the advent of colonialism was simultaneously the occasion for the large-scale intervention in the domain of colonial public sphere, demanding an end to the Brahminical rule and the abolition of the caste system. Guha quite clearly, for the lower caste, above everything else, Hindu nationalism was a project of reinvigorating and reinstalling Brahminical rule in modern India. Thus, Ram observes that Hinduism emerged as an identity for people in the subcontinent only from medieval times, and that it is only much later that it is being projected as a national religion centering around Ram, the god, and Gita, the holy book. Historically, there were multiple belief systems, but Vedas was given prominence as an essential component of Hinduism. Consolidation of Brahminical ethos took place during the Maurya period around Upanishads, Vedantic thoughts, and Manusmriti. Every religious thought that had once found expression in India and handed down a sacred heirloom was preserved by Indian mind instead of one thought superseding the more exalted thought. Hinduism soon attained social and political hegemony over Jainism and Buddhism after violent confrontations. Similarly, the existence of streams and cults and identities, the Brahminical domination propagated Hinduism based on Vedas and Brahmins as the religion of India. But many did not identify with it as they worshipped the non-Vedic gods under the trend of Sikhism and Bhakti. In the 20th century, Hinduism did away with pluralism and the term Hindutva emerged along with the geopolitical nationalism. This led to exclusions of other faiths having equal status with Hindus. Upper class heroes like Ram were worshipped and popular movements like Bhakti were excluded. It projected homogeneity, rigidity through the Sangh Parivar, achieved hegemony over society, asserting that Hindus constitute the nation and are original inhabitants, creators, which was to tackle the non-Hindus, especially the Muslims. A social common sense was developed to institute amongst the people that Hinduism is a superior religion to all other cultures, and Hinduism or Hindutva was made to appear a way of life. Hinduism, as we know, did not affirm to a single god, institution or holy book. Hence, religious organizations were formed which constituted new communities of believers of Hinduism with an aim to mobilize against the dominant religion, Christianity. Thus, in this module we have seen how Hinduism, which was not a very homogeneous kind of religion, got constructed as one immanent, all-encompassing, pan-Indian phenomena. And we have seen what were the various strategies and what were the various reasons, causes for the formation of this particular identity of Hinduism. There were social reform movements which began with Rajaram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekanand, and even political actors such as Lokmanya Tilak and Savarkar played an important role in the formation of an ideology of Hindutva.